These days, it may not be a bad thing to do. But by following the links, which identify, other pages or positions on the pages where the log records are, I can just get to the log records on behalf of a particular transaction. So I know where to find the most recent record that was written by the transaction that rolled back. That's kept in memory. If the thing crashes, I get to that most recent record, which is going to have backward links to the previous record for that transaction. So I can just find those transactions inside the log. And often the records on behalf of a transaction, by the way, the log is persisted. I'll mention right now, the log is also kept in memory. Not all of it, but the most recent part of the log, what's called the log tail. You keep the most recent part in memory, because if I have to undo a transaction, I don't have to go out to this to do that. And most transactions tend to be relatively short. So, and memory is big, so I will keep the things that I need to undo the transaction around to play with them. So the log, as I mentioned, is append only. You only write to the tail of the log. Something to think about. I'm not going to give you the answer to this one yet, but something to think about. When I append to the log, do I overwrite the most recent log record, log block? Think about what works and what doesn't work if I do that. I'm not going to answer it now, I'll talk about it later. Do I overwrite my last log block or not? Again, we will talk about it later. Interesting answers to that. Every record has what's called a log sequence number. This is an implementation choice. Every implementation that I know about does this. And the log sequence numbers just keep increasing. It's just a number, and it always increases. So the log records are ordered. And the records, so one of the ways that you can point to a previous log record is you give its log sequence number. So every record you write has a log sequence number. The log is append only. The log sequence numbers are increasing, not just for each transaction, but period. There is a log sequence number for every record in the log. There is a sort of a global log sequence number that always goes up, not just equal, but greater than other records. And here's a really important point. I've got the sequence, I've got, let's say, the last 5 blocks that I've written to the log. I always write the records and the blocks in order. I will write those 5 blocks. If I happen to somehow already manage to only write the 4th block and not having blocks 1, 2, 3, I've got a log with missing stuff in it. That doesn't work. So maybe I can just do a chain thing and write blocks 1 to 5 together out to the log. But again, if I somehow manage only to get block 4, then block 4 doesn't count because 1, 2, 3 have to be there before. It has to be an ordered sequential file the way things are written. Now here's the interesting question. When do I have to force the log? Remember, when I force a block of the log, everything before it has to either been previously forced or forced now. I can't write block 2004 if I haven't written 2003, 2002, and all the ones before. But do I have to force the log every time I write to the log? How many think yes? How many think no? It's on the slide, so everybody should think no. Reading is a prereq. I don't have to force the log because unless I'm writing a commit, the stuff that I have in the log isn't gonna matter because I have write-ahead log. I don't have to force the log. I do have to force it when there's a commit because I need to be able to ensure that everything's available for doing the redo. But if I do have to do undos because I have read-ahead log, that's gonna guarantee that read-ahead log and that commit, those are 2 important properties about what I have to force. But because I have write-ahead log, I don't have to force the log. If I'm, let's say, writing something, this thing changed, whatever it is, no need to force. Only when I have a commit and also following the principles of write-ahead log, those are the principles that tell me when I have to force. In fact, when I roll back a transaction, I don't have to force. There may be things on behalf of that transaction that were written out that may have to be undone because it rolled back, but because of write-ahead log, that's going to be possible. Really interesting ideas going on here in terms of the ordering of what's happening. And again, this is the overview. We will be spending a lot of time on this. Then there's the notion of a checkpoint. Something that I may have said in 180, maybe not, I will say it here. The log, of course, describes all the changes you're doing. The database is a very interesting view on the log. The database is the current state of all the log changes that you have. If you apply all the log changes from the beginning of time, you'll get the database. Assuming that I log loads, which often aren't logged, but let's make believe they were. The database is what I get by basically doing an aggregation from the beginning of time of everything that's in the log. So if there's a crash, I can always recover by taking the log from an empty database that I had 7 years ago and rolling forward based on the log. Do I want to go ahead and take 7 years worth of log and apply it to capture the database if there's a crash? I don't think so. Not if I have a moderately active database. So there is a term, and again, we're going to go through this in detail, called a checkpoint. I always get confused about this because Tandem used the term checkpoint for something different, but we're going to use checkpoint the way it's used typically in a database. You don't want to go back to the beginning of time, even though you could. You don't want to keep all that much log around. You don't want to take all the time to roll forward. There are lots of techniques for this. Basically, there are periodic. It used to be, every 5 seconds or 10 seconds. Now it could be more often than that. But basically what you do is you create what's called a checkpoint. The checkpoint is not a completely consistent image of the database. That would be expensive. But you keep track of a checkpoint, which you can think of as being something which, together with the state of the database and the checkpoint and the log records that occurred since the checkpoint started, you're going to be able to reconstruct the database moderately quickly. So one more time, you take the state of the database as the one you started the checkpoint. You take the information that is in the checkpoint, and we'll talk about what's in that later. And then you take the log records that were written after the checkpoint started. And those things together allow you to reconstruct the current state of the database quickly. There are some really clever instantaneous things for recovering that are even better. Again, I'll give you a pointer to some of this stuff. If you ask me, I think I have it as one of these lectures. If not, I'll add to it. But there's great stuff on that. So basically, what does the checkpoint have? I'm hand waving. We'll go into detail later. The checkpoint describes all the transactions that were going on at the time the checkpoint started. And it also describes the pages that might be dirty. What does dirty mean? They have changes in them that haven't made it out to disk yet. The things where remember that dirty bit? It says it's dirty. Question.
So this is a checkpoint that will recover from the system crashing, but not the durable storage crashing. So it's not like restoring from the backup.
Basically what there's a notion of backups that you do of the durable storage, and the backups plus the log will allow you to be able to construct. Also, you may have some kind of mirroring or other approach using RAID with parity that allows you to construct as well. But yes, this is something that allows you to recover after a database failure or a wide range failure. Media failure will have to be is possible and will follow other means. Okay, so there are things you need to be able to do. You need to be able to handle, redo, and undo. And again, we're going to go through this in detail. I'll just give you a first taste of this. You need to be able to deal with dirty pages that committed, before the checkpoint, transactions that committed after the checkpoint. So anything that committed, you have to make sure that all of its changes made it through. You'll know about things that might have been in flight at the time the checkpoint started, some of which may have committed, some of which not. You also have to deal with things that were rolled back. And here's the other interesting thing. If you have a transaction that was in flight, that was active, and crashed at the time that basically an active transaction that was active when the database system crashed. You know what happens to that transaction in this scheme? It gets rolled back. So there are 3 kinds of transactions. Those that were committed, whether before or after. You have to make sure they all happened. Transactions that rolled back, either before or after, you have to make sure they were rolled back. Without somewhere they rolled back, so you don't have to do it again. For example, anything that was rolled back before the checkpoint already rolled back. Anything that was committed before the checkpoint started, already committed. You don't have to play with that again. But you're dealing with the last part of the log after the checkpoint. You take what's on the disk together with the checkpoint, together with the log, together with really important idempotent principles to be able to reconstruct the database. And the things that were committed and rolled back, committed and rolled back. The things that were active, they also get rolled back. This is no way of finishing it. So there are 3 phases that are inside the recovery algorithm, an algorithm called ARIES that a friend of mine by the name of Mohan was the key person who was and still is an IBM analyst. He was a key author on this. And the 3 phases are analysis, redo, and undo. And there are lots of games that can be played improving it, but we're just going to go through the basic algorithm when we get to it. The first phase is you're going to look at the most recent checkpoint. And you're going to figure out what's going on by playing with the log, identifying all the transactions that were active and all the dirty pages in the buffer pool. So you figure out what's going on. That isn't reflected inside the database. Then what you're going to do is you're going to redo. You're going to make sure that all the dirty pages, now remember, they could be dirty because of transactions that committed. They could be dirty because of transactions that were rolled back after the checkpoint started. And they could be dirty because of transactions that were active. But what you're going to do is you're going to redo writing everything that's dirty. Some of which is going to stay around and some of which isn't. So you're going to put in all their after values. And what you've done is you've put in the values both for the transactions that committed and also for the transactions that rolled back after the start of the checkpoint and for the transactions that were active at the time of the checkpoint. So you've done too much. There are clever ways of avoiding some of that. But everything that you wanted committed has now been committed by doing the redo. During the undo phase, you know about the transactions that were in flight and the transactions that explicitly rolled back that are in the log. So you do the undo going backwards through the log. You're going to go backwards through the log and undo everything that you're supposed to undo. And that's going to ensure that the transactions that weren't supposed to commit didn't commit. So analysis, figure out what the heck's going on, redo, take everything that was dirty and put its changes out there, whether it committed or not. And then undo, you're going to take the stuff that wasn't supposed to commit and you get rid of its changes. Again, that's all that's going on. Again, more detail is going to be coming up. A few notes about it. The hardest part is something that Mohan and I and Irv Traeger talked about how System R did this, which was not well understood. And we finally understood it, but Mohan ended up simplifying it like crazy. The hardest part of dealing with crash recovery, by far, is dealing with the possibility of a crash happening during crash recovery. It's a pain. The algorithm you're going to see is going to be easier to understand by far than what System R did. And it, again, is the basis for a lot of algorithms that are still used, although there are improvements in what we're talking about. But some of the stuff you will see is there to ensure that if you crash while you're crash recovering, or crash during recovering from crash recovery, or any kind of recursive multiple recoveries, that everything's still going to be cool. That is by far the hardest part of this. It's the part that people often end up forgetting. Okay? By far the hardest part of this. Okay? We didn't talk about well, I actually did talk about before-after values for updates, but again, insert can be thought of as putting in a new value with the old value as it's gone. Delete, again, undo is going to put back the value you deleted, redo is going to get rid of it. And basically, everything that we're talking about in these 3 lectures, except for the hotspot things that we've talked about, which affect how you write your applications. You've never had to deal with this when you use Postgres or any other database. It's there. It works with the isolation level you specified. Almost always works. But it's transparent to you as an application programmer, except for things like hotspot and other performance issues. Applications do need to deal with the possibility that they get a rollback. That's not transparent. Even when you commit any SQL statement, you might be told your transaction rolled back. So summary, concurrency, control, and recovery are really important. Users don't have to mess around and understand about them. Again, we get serializability by following two-phase by following two-phase locking. I'm gonna give you a warning right now. 2PL, two-phase locking, get used to that term. Just as you can easily confuse lock and log, we will later be getting to something called two-phase commit when we talk about distributed transactions. 2PL is what we've talked about in this lecture, and strict 2PL, which avoids cascading rollbacks. We will be talking about two-phase locking, two-phase commit. Do not confuse that with two-phase locking. We've talked about high level, what's going on in write-ahead log, and again, you're going to be seeing details about that later. And again, you get to a consistent state in which the only things that you see are the effects of the committed transactions. So all that is going to end up being there. By the way, I know, again, we've talked about one person whose team is changing. If there are other people whose teams are changing, please let me know, because per the lecture that I'm about to put up, again, a reminder that project 3 is due by Thursday, and you're dealing with B trees, and you have an ability to print out the B tree, and I also gave you things for showing, the JSON in prettier form. So I gave you pointers that allow you to take your JSON description of the B tree and look at it, first of all, validation, and also looking at it in a prettier form. We haven't gotten to project 4 yet. Project 3 is discussed in the previous lecture. There is going to be a project 4, which is going to be implementing a query engine, which I'll say more about another time. I won't go into it now. I'll go into it on Friday. It says project 3 solutions on payouts. No, it isn't. Not yet. It will be posted. We have to follow the guidelines. So I got pretty far on that. But I do want to remind you about the final exam. And the usual rules apply. It's 3 hours. It's going to include stuff from the entire term, 4 to 7 p.m. And everything from the projects could be covered on the final, as well as all the material in class. The usual 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, anything you want, that's written on it. I will post last year's final, but there is no answer sheet for it, since I tend not to post the answers to the final, but I'll be happy to talk about the answers to it on Piazza or otherwise if you have questions. So I'm a little bit ahead of myself here, but that's okay. So you already know about locks, because we already talked about that. I'm just going to skip forward because you know about what's going on, including lock upgrades. You know about deadlocks and prevention and detection. And now we're going to talk about something a little bit different. I told you that there are S and X locks. We're going to get to other lock modes right now. And we'll also talk about locking trees. So we have another 8 minutes. I'm going to use them. Okay? For everything that we've been doing so far, we've been locking tuples. In practice, there are cases where either the user or the system may want to lock things at a different granularity. In fact, for years, the Sybase database system only had page-level locking. What does page-level locking mean? What does table-level locking or database-level locking? Well, instead of having to lock each tuple, you can just lock all the tuples on the page by locking the page. That's wonderful, because I don't have to bother getting locks on every single tuple inside the page. So I just lock the page. It's also terrible. It was a serious problem for Sybase, which now is part of SAP. Because not only do you save the effort of locking each tuple individually, you have all this false locking going on, where what you care about is locking one tuple to prevent people from getting it, but you're locking every darn thing that's on the page, even when there isn't something conflicting. Suppose you have a big page and you have 1,000 tuples on the page. You lock the page, you're preventing anybody else, let's say you're locking in X mode, you're preventing anybody else from reading the page or writing something to the page, even when there's no conflict that's going on. So we can talk about lock granularities. You can lock at the tuple level, you can lock at the page level, table level, database level. What happens if you lock at the database level? Ain't nobody, if you're writing one, ain't nobody touching this database but me. I'm important, you're not important. Yeah, not a friendly act. But you get your work done. If you lock at the table level, same thing. Nobody else can touch that table. I've already talked about the page level. So there's a hierarchy that's going on here, and we're assuming in this diagram that only a single table is on a page, that we're not having multiple tables on the same page. If you could have multiple tables on the same page, then you would be able to play this game. Now, what's nice, if I'm changing a lot of stuff inside the table, locking the table, I'm just done. Nice and simple. And in fact, there are systems, most systems have a capability which is called, escalation, lock escalation. Where if you're locking lots and lots of pages on the table, it'll say, I don't want to keep messing with this. I'm going to see about getting you an X lock on the entire table, or a partition of the table. So that can automatically be done by systems operating with a course of granularity. And now, I'm going to go through this. You see what it says at the top? I'm not going to go over this on the final. I'm going to go over this quickly. And there are a couple of slides here where, again, I'm saying not included on the final. So basically, there are modes besides S and X. There's IS, there's IS, IX, and there's also 6, which has nothing to do with the number 6. It's just an abbreviation for having an S lock plus an IX lock. The locks with the I on them are called intention locks. It's saying, I intend to do something with the stuff that's below this in my hierarchy. What's my hierarchy? The stuff that's described over here. So for example, I might get an IX lock on a page, which is going to say I may be doing updates with the tuples that are on that page. I intend to do that. Okay, so basically, to get an S or an IS lock on a node, you have to hold an IS or an IX lock on its parent. Again, what do I mean by parent? This is the thing that I'm talking about with parent. So if I want to get an IS lock on the table, I have to have an IS lock on the database. Again, it corresponds to the hierarchy. What I want to be able to do is to have locking that can go on at multiple different levels of this hierarchy, where it's going to avoid conflicting with each other. Okay, so an SIX lock is just an abbreviation for having both an S lock and an IX lock. And so to be able to get an X lock or an IX lock or an SIX, which is an S plus an IX, I have to have something with the IX on the parent node. I have to be able to have things with the parent node. And the other part of this is I have to release the locks in bottom-up order. When I again move by bottom-up, I mean bottom-up corresponding to that hierarchy. Okay, so basically, the protocol, and I'll show you the lock table in the next slide. The protocol is going to be correct in that it's going to give you the same results as if you had actually locked the tuples. It's going to give you the same results in terms of locking. And here's a picture of what the compatibility mode is. For example, IX is compatible with IX, because you're saying two transactions both intend to lock things, let's say, on that page, but they may be locking different tuples on that page. So it just says, I want to lock something that's below this. And so this allows you to be able to play with the locks in a way that you could, for example, get an X lock on a page. But notice that X is not compatible with IX. X is not compatible with IX. X is also not compatible with S. Look at the things going on. Is basically, you need to be able to have the combination of the S and the X lock to be able to do things together. You yourself can have both the S and the IX lock, but if you have an IX lock, nobody else can have an S. So you can have S and IX, which is 6, but nobody else can go ahead and do it. So as an example, and again, this is not included in the final, it's the last thing that I will say, I've got 2 minutes, just examples. Suppose that T1 is going to scan everything inside R and it's going to update a few of the tuples of R. Then what it could do is get an SIX lock on R, which is a combination of IX and S lock, read lock, and the intention to lock below. And then what it's going to do is it's repeatedly going to get the S locks on the tuples of relation R. And on some of them, it's going to go ahead and get an X lock on the tuples, which is okay. You can get an X lock if you've got the IX above them. So this is a way of having locks at multiple levels that ends up working. Again, I'm going to go through this very quickly. Another example is I'm going to use an index and I'm going to read part of R. What I can do is I can get an IS lock on R, and then I can repeatedly get S locks on the tuples of R. What's the advantage of getting the IS lock? Getting the IS lock is gonna prevent anybody else from, being able to get, you know, the incompatible lock. So I'm gonna get the IS lock on R, which again is gonna be incompatible with anybody else getting an X lock. On R, and I will occasionally get S locks on the tuples of R. It's not stopping anybody else from getting X locks on some of the tuples as they go, but I will get the S locks on the tuples when I want them. This, again, details about how this works are to some extent are described in the book. I'm going through this very, very rapidly. The comment again is this will work as if I was only locking at the tuple level, but it allows me to be able to lock at a higher granularity, preventing other people from coming in and messing me up. Suppose that a third transaction is reading all of R, it can get an S lock on R. Bang, it's got the shared lock on R. Or what it could do is it can behave the same way that T2 did, basically getting an IS lock on R and repeatedly getting S locks on R. But in many systems, what would happen is the system would automatically choose, if I keep trying to get lots and lots of S locks on the tuples, it could decide on its own to update to the higher granularity and get a shared lock on the entire relation. So you could do it. This is a place where you can, inside your program, ask for the higher granular locks in most systems. This again affects the application. You never have to, but you could end up getting performance that's better and avoiding getting rollback as often if you explicitly go ahead and do this. So both of these slides will not be included on the final. I am now out of time. Again, if there were, I assume at this point, if people have questions about the midterm, that you've asked them of me or